take a slow, deep breath and let it fade. Tonight, we're drifting into the Cold War, not with tension, but with quiet. No alarms, no urgency, just calm, gentle facts, whispered from history to help you slow down and fall asleep. A war without war. The Cold War is often called a war, but in truth, it defies the word. It wasn't declared. It wasn't fought in trenches. It didn't open with thunder, nor end with applause. There were no invasions between the superpowers, no surrender. It was a war marked by its restraint, a long and calculated stillness that stretched across oceans and decades, and yet it changed the world. After World War II ended, the world stood at a crossroads. Two powers had emerged stronger than all others, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had stood together in wartime, but only briefly, out of necessity. Beneath the surface, they were opposites. One stood for capitalism, democracy, individual freedoms, and open markets. The other believed in state power, collective identity, central planning, and a future guided by Marxist ideals. Two ideologies, two worldviews, both claiming to offer the better path forward. So they didn't clash outright. Instead, they looked at each other with suspicion and turned away. Each began to build walls, not just physical ones, but psychological, political, and technological. The Cold War didn't erupt. It settled, slowly, like frost creeping across a window pane. There were no front lines in this war, but there were borders everywhere. It was fought in embassies and back channels, in radio transmissions and classified memos, through spies and proxy wars, through rhetoric, economics, and influence. The battlefields weren't soaked in mud, but filled with ideas, symbols, and satellite feeds. The Cold War lived in silence and in noise. It whispered through propaganda. It echoed in televised speeches, and echoed even louder in the silence of the classroom, the shelter, the uneasy stare across checkpoints. And always, there was the shadow of something worse, the threat that sat behind every meeting, every press conference, every failed treaty: nuclear war. For the first time in history, humanity had created a weapon that could end itself, and both sides had it. Not just a few bombs, but thousands, entire stockpiles capable of annihilating the planet. They called it mutually assured destruction. It wasn't a strategy. It was a grim balance. The knowledge that if one side attacked, the other would retaliate, and there would be nothing left. Peace was preserved not through trust, but through fear. The most terrifying kind of stability. Still, life continued. Children went to school. Radios played music. People fell in love, built homes, read the newspaper. In some places, the Cold War was an abstraction. In others, it was a daily reality. In Berlin, it took the shape of a wall. In Cuba, it looked like a missile. In Vietnam, it turned into fire. The Cold War never became World War III, but it touched nearly every corner of the globe in some way. It was, in a quiet and persistent way, everywhere. And through it all, both sides watched each other, from space, from embassies, from across borders and behind fences. They waited, calculated, postured, planned. They built not just to fight, but to prevent fighting. Submarines patrolled silently beneath the oceans. Satellites drifted above the clouds. Leaders carried briefcases with codes no one ever wanted to use. And the world held its breath. For more than 40 years, the Cold War remained suspended, not static, but frozen in motion. Crises came and went. Alliances shifted. Technology advanced. The space race launched humanity beyond Earth. Computer science leapt forward. And even amid tension, there was progress. Strange, ironic progress, born of fear. When the Cold War finally ended, it didn't collapse in fire. It cracked, quietly. Walls were chipped away, regimes changed, speeches became softer, people crossed streets they once couldn't. And the decades-long standoff faded into memory. The Cold War was a war without war, but it was no less real. It reshaped nations, generations, and the global imagination. Not through invasion, but through the tension of what might have been, through silence and shadow and restraint. It taught the world that sometimes power is shown not in the fight itself, but in the refusal to begin one. The Iron Curtain descends. After the smoke of World War II lifted, Europe stood in pieces, not just shattered buildings and broken roads, but borders blurred and governments in flux. In that fragile in-between moment, two visions of the future began to take shape. On one side, a world rebuilt with democracy, trade, and independence. On the other, a union of states drawn into the orbit of the Soviet Union, aligned under one ideology, communism. And between them, something invisible, yet impossible to ignore. Winston Churchill gave it a name. In 1946, standing before an audience in Fulton, Missouri, he spoke of a shadow falling across the continent. He said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The phrase was vivid, stark, and it stuck. It captured the sense of something heavy and unyielding, closing off the East from the West, not with metal, but with fear, with surveillance, with control. But this Iron Curtain wasn't a single wall or structure. It was a line of division that stretched through the heart of Europe. Countries once liberated from Nazi occupation found themselves under Soviet influence. Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. Their governments aligned with Moscow. Their borders tightened. Western ideas were shut out. Dissent was dangerous, and movement was no longer free. To the West, this growing divide felt like a betrayal of what had just been fought for. The Allies had bled and burned to stop tyranny, only to watch another kind of control rise in its place. To the Soviets, it was a necessary shield, protection against future invasion, against capitalist encirclement, against Western interference. And so the Iron Curtain stood, not as a wall, but as a warning. Life on either side of that curtain unfolded differently. In the West, nations rebuilt with help from the Marshall Plan, forming alliances, opening economies, debating ideas in public squares and parliaments. In the East, nations rebuilt too, but under the guidance of a centralized power. Information flowed carefully. Elections were tightly managed. Education, art, and speech followed the party line. There was pride, there was resilience, but also limits. And the curtain made sure those limits remained in place. Even the maps changed. Cities that once sat on trade routes became dead ends. Rivers that once connected were now guarded. Rail lines were severed. Families found themselves separated overnight. Friends couldn't visit. Letters were censored. And the languages of the Cold War took shape. Security, loyalty, surveillance, and silence. The Iron Curtain wasn't just physical or political, it was emotional. It bred a constant sense of division, us and them, inside and outside, watched and watching. And for people who lived near the curtain or under its shadow, it was always present. You could feel it in the way people spoke or didn't, in what could be read and what couldn't, in what questions were safe and what answers were rehearsed. And yet, even with the curtain drawn, people found ways to connect. A smuggled photograph, a whispered story, a song heard across a border late at night. Despite everything, human curiosity still drifted across the divide. The Iron Curtain would remain in place for decades, not in steel, but in policy, in fear, in tension held like breath. It became the backdrop of the Cold War, the quiet edge of a continent no longer at war, but never quite at peace. And when it finally began to lift, years later, it didn't rise all at once. It cracked, it sagged, it was pulled back, piece by protests, by courage, by conversations once thought impossible, and eventually by people who simply walked across where it had once stood. But in those early days, when Churchill first spoke the words, the world was still adjusting to the idea of division, to a Europe no longer united by war, but split by the fear of what might come next. The Iron Curtain was a metaphor, but for millions, it was also reality. Berlin split in two. When the war ended in 1945, Berlin was a city in ruins, bombed, broken, and burned. Its once grand boulevards now crumbled into dust. Buildings stood half-fallen, streets led to nowhere. And yet, beneath the rubble, the future was already being decided. Because Berlin, more than any other place in Europe, would become the symbol of everything the Cold War would come to mean. At the end of World War II, the Allies, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France, divided Germany into 4 zones of occupation. The plan was temporary, a way to restore order before rebuilding a united country. But unity proved fragile. Trust between East and West dissolved quickly. And though Berlin sat deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of Eastern Germany, it too was split into 4 parts, one for each power. This single city now had 2 hearts. In the West, the sectors controlled by the US, Britain, and France, life leaned toward freedom, capitalism, and reconstruction. In the East, under Soviet control, life moved in a different direction, towards state control, centralized planning, and ideological conformity. And as the Cold War deepened, Berlin became a city defined not just by streets and buildings, but by contrast. People could cross the city freely in the early years. A train could still travel from east to west. Families lived across zones. Children went to school in one sector and came home to another. There was tension, yes, growing unease, but there was still movement. Still hope that this division wouldn't last. But the divide only deepened. The Western zones introduced new currency. The Soviets responded with a blockade. Then came the Berlin airlift. A year of food and fuel dropped from the sky, day and night, to keep the western part of the city alive. And by the early 1950s, the differences were too stark to ignore. In West Berlin, advertisements returned. Jazz played on the radio. Newspapers questioned policy. In East Berlin, the news was curated, the choices fewer, the government present in everyday life. And still, the border remained open. But not for long, because people were leaving. By the thousands, East Germans were crossing into West Berlin and not returning. They saw opportunity, freedom, possibility, and they stepped toward it. Doctors, engineers, teachers, young people, an entire generation was slipping away. It was an embarrassment for the East and a growing crisis, so the border closed. On the night of August 13th, 1961, it began quietly. Barbed wire rolled out across streets. Guards posted at intersections. Roads were dug up. Rail lines stopped. In time, the wire became concrete. A wall, tall and long, snaking through neighborhoods, cutting across parks, cemeteries, even homes. The city was no longer divided in theory. It was divided in stone. The Berlin Wall was not just a barrier. It was a message. It said, "You cannot leave, you cannot choose, you are here, and here you remain." Families were split. Loved ones became unreachable overnight. Windows facing the wall were bricked up. Streets led to dead ends. The wall was watched, guarded, armed. And yet, people still tried to cross. Some succeeded. Many did not. On one side of the wall, colour, noise, movement. On the other, order, discipline, control. Neither was simple. Neither was perfect. But together, they made Berlin the sharpest point of the Cold War. And as years passed, the wall became normal, a part of the landscape. It loomed in the background of conversations. It cast a shadow on futures. Children grew up never knowing anything else. Visitors came to see it. Artists painted it. Protesters shouted near it. But still, it stood. Until it didn't. In 1989, in a year of impossible change, the wall opened. Not with explosions, not with armies, but with footsteps. People gathered, crowds swelled. The border guards, unprepared, let them pass. And just like that, Berlin was no longer two cities, but one. The scars remained, of course, they always do. But so did the memory of a place split not by distance, but by ideology. A city where every corner told a story, and every crack in the concrete held the sound of history, waiting to be heard. The Berlin Airlift. In 1948, Berlin stood as an island, not of land, but of belief. Deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, the western part of the city remained tied to the ideals of democracy and freedom. It was an uneasy coexistence, a fragile compromise between former allies turned ideological rivals. And then, almost without warning, the gates closed. Roads were blocked. Rail lines stopped. Power plants were cut. The Soviet Union had sealed off West Berlin, a city of 2 million people, in an attempt to force the Allies to abandon it. It was a blockade not of bullets, but of silence. No tanks, no bombs. Just a quiet, calculated suffocation. But the city didn't surrender. It couldn't. And so, the West responded, not with force, but with flight. Operation Vittles, as it was officially called, began in June 1948. But it became known to the world as the Berlin Airlift. Instead of fighting for the city, the Allies would fly for it. Day after day, plane after plane took off from Allied airfields in the West, carrying supplies into Berlin. Coal, flour, milk, medicine, fuel, books, everything a city needed to survive. The skies above Germany became a highway of hope, stretching across the Iron Curtain. Pilots flew in narrow corridors, braving bad weather, tight turns, and strict schedules. Every 3 minutes, another plane landed. Every 3 minutes, another lifeline arrived. At its peak, over 1,500 flights landed in a single day. The city's airports, battered from war, became the heartbeat of survival. Children watched from rooftops. Families marked time by the rumble overhead. A rhythm of engines, a promise in motion. For 11 months, the air never rested. It wasn't easy. Planes crashed. Crews were exhausted. Mistakes happened. But still, the airlift held. It was a quiet defiance, a soft-spoken refusal to let a city fall. And it was a message, to Berlin, to Moscow, to the world, that freedom, even surrounded, would not be abandoned. In the midst of it all, small stories took flight. An American pilot named Gail Halvorson, moved by the sight of Berlin's children watching from the barbed wire fences, began dropping candy from his plane. Tiny parachutes carrying sweetness and surprise. He became known as the Candy Bomber, and the gesture turned into a tradition. Other pilots joined in. Chocolate, gum, raisins. The sky became a source not only of food, but of comfort. It reminded people, especially the young, that they were not forgotten. The blockade lasted 322 days. Then, quietly, the Soviets lifted it. No deal. No surrender. Just a quiet retreat. The airlift had worked. Berlin had endured. Not through confrontation, but through endurance. Through the patience of pilots, the coordination of crews, the resilience of people who waited and believed. When the last plane landed, it was not with fanfare, just another flight, another delivery, and then silence. A city left standing, a point made, not with fire, but with faith. The Berlin Airlift was more than a logistical feat. It was a statement. A moment when cooperation stood against coercion. When planes brought not just supplies, but solidarity. And though the Cold War would continue, this was one of the first moments where the world saw what that war would truly look like. Not only in confrontation, but in care. Not just in what nations built, but in what they refused to let fall. And in that long year of noise overhead and pressure on the ground, Berlin was not just a city. It became a symbol of resistance, of survival, and of how sometimes the quiet persistence of doing the right thing is more powerful than any wall, any blockade, or any threat. Red Scare, whispered fear. Not every battle of the Cold War happened in distant lands. Not every fear was pointed outward. In the United States, during the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a different kind of tension took root, not on the front lines, but in the hearts of neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. It was called the Red Scare, and it wasn't a war against bombs or soldiers. It was a war against belief, against the idea that communism might not only live abroad, but here, at home, disguised, hidden, waiting. The fear was real, or at least, it felt real. The Soviet Union had exploded its first nuclear bomb in 1949, years ahead of what many American officials expected. China had fallen to communism. North Korea would soon invade the South. To many in the West, it seemed the world was shifting step by step towards something unfamiliar and frightening. And in that atmosphere, suspicion found its voice. Congress created the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. Its job was to investigate subversive elements, people believed to be disloyal, dangerous, or simply different. Artists, teachers, government workers, even factory employees. Anyone could be called to testify. Some were accused based on thin evidence. Others were suspected for who they knew, or what they read, or simply for refusing to name others. Careers ended. Reputations collapsed. Families were shaken. In Hollywood, screenwriters and directors were blacklisted, denied work not because of what they had done, but because of what they were suspected of believing. Films were rewritten. Scripts disappeared. In offices, loyalty oaths became common. People swore not only allegiance to the flag, but to certain ideas, certain lines of thinking. To speak against it was to raise a red flag, quite literally. Even silence was dangerous. Senator Joseph McCarthy became the face of the movement. With a wave of papers in his hand and a voice sharpened by certainty, he claimed to hold lists of communists working inside the US government. His accusations were sweeping, dramatic, often vague, but they captured the nation's attention. For a time, McCarthy's power seemed unstoppable. Lives could be shattered by a single televised hearing, a name on a list, a look that lasted too long. But eventually the tide began to turn. In 1954, during a now famous moment in the Army McCarthy hearings, Attorney Joseph Welch spoke a line that echoed across the country. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And in that instant, something cracked. The crowd paused. The cameras caught it. The country, slowly, began to question what it had accepted. McCarthy was censured by the Senate. His influence faded. But the atmosphere he had helped create would linger far longer. Because fear leaves footprints, it moves quietly, hiding in laws, in rumors, in silences that stretch a little too long. The Red Scare taught a generation to look over their shoulder, to think twice before they spoke. And while most Americans never experienced it directly, its presence was everywhere, in classrooms, in film scripts, in the books people chose not to borrow from the library, in the questions they chose not to ask. Even now, decades later, the Red Scare remains a cautionary echo, a reminder of how quickly fear can shift from vigilance to suspicion, and from suspicion to harm, of how easy it is to confuse disagreement with disloyalty, and how sometimes the hardest freedoms to protect are the ones we can't see. The right to think, to doubt, to speak, and to remain silent. In a time of growing division between East and West, the Red Scare showed that the Cold War didn't always need enemies abroad. Sometimes, the most unsettling battles were imagined to be much closer to home. And in the quiet hum of suspicion, many people stopped asking questions. Not because they believed the answers were wrong, but because they were afraid of the consequences of asking. NATO is born. By 1949, just 4 years after the end of the Second World War, the hope for lasting peace had already begun to fade. Tensions between East and West were no longer whispers. They were policies, alliances, and visible divisions stretching across the European continent. Countries that had once fought side by side now eyed each other with guarded caution. And in the midst of that unease, the nations of the West gathered to make a promise, not for conquest, not for power, but for protection, for reassurance, for unity. That promise became NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It began with 12 nations: the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Portugal. Together they signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4th, 1949. It was not just a piece of paper, it was a statement to the world. It said, "If one of us is attacked, we will all respond. An attack on one is an attack on all." It was a powerful idea, collective defense, born not out of aggression, but out of fear. Fear that what had happened once could happen again. That Stalin's Soviet Union, expanding its influence over Eastern Europe, might not stop at influence alone. That one day, tanks could roll westward once more. And that this time, no one wanted to face that possibility alone. So NATO formed as a shield, a defensive alliance meant to deter, not provoke. Its power came not only from its armies, but from its unity. Countries large and small stood together. A strike against Norway was a strike against the United States. A threat to Belgium meant a response from Canada. It changed the calculus of any future conflict. But NATO was more than just a military pact. It was also symbolic. A reassurance that democratic nations across the Atlantic were bound not just by security interests, but by shared values: liberty, democracy, individual rights, the rule of law. These weren't just slogans. They were the foundation of the alliance. And in a world dividing into East and West, that mattered. Behind the scenes, however, NATO's creation wasn't simple. There were debates, hesitations, quiet doubts. Some feared it would provoke the Soviet Union. Others worried about giving up control to a supranational alliance. But in the end, the threat of isolation felt greater. And so, one by one, the signatures were added. The alliance was born. In practical terms, NATO began with few troops and little infrastructure. But that changed quickly. Command structures were built, exercises held, a military committee established. Over time, NATO's presence became physical, with bases, war plans, and integrated forces ready to respond. The Soviets responded in kind. In 1955, they formed the Warsaw Pact, their own military alliance of Eastern Bloc nations, echoing the structure of NATO. The world now had two armed coalitions facing each other across a divided continent. And while open conflict was avoided, the potential for it, the fear of it, shaped every decision. NATO expanded slowly in the decades that followed. More countries joined, some left and later returned. The alliance adapted, evolved, survived. And though it would be tested again and again, in Korea, in Cuba, in Berlin, it remained intact. But in 1949, at its founding, NATO was still new, still uncertain. And yet, for millions living in post-war Europe, it was a comfort, a reminder that they weren't alone, that if the Cold War ever turned hot, they would not face it in silence. At its heart, NATO was, and remains, a promise, a quiet one. It does not seek the spotlight. It does not shout. But in moments of tension, it stands. And as the Cold War deepened, it would become not just a military alliance, but a symbol of stability, of unity, and of the belief that peace, while fragile, is worth protecting together. The Soviet answer, the Warsaw Pact. In 1949, when NATO was born, it sent a quiet message. The Western nations were no longer standing alone. And while the Soviet Union didn't respond immediately, the message was not forgotten. For years, Moscow watched as NATO grew. More countries, more coordination, more military strength pooling just across the curtain. For the Soviets, it wasn't simply a defensive alliance. It looked like containment, encirclement, a wall of pressure tightening from the West. So, in 1955, the Soviet Union made its answer, the Warsaw Pact. Officially, it was the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, a long name for something very clear, an alliance of Eastern Bloc nations united under Soviet leadership. It included the Soviet Union, of course, along with Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. It mirrored NATO's structure, joint military command, shared defense planning, coordinated training. But its purpose was shaped by something more than just mutual protection. It was a tool of control. The Warsaw Pact was formed just weeks after West Germany was admitted into NATO, a decision that struck a nerve in Moscow. The idea of a rearmed Germany, once an invader of the Soviet homeland, now aligned with the United States, was alarming to Soviet leaders. They needed a show of unity, a message, a line drawn in response. And so, the Warsaw Pact was born not simply out of alliance, but out of necessity, a counterbalance, a shield, and a leash. Because unlike NATO, where member states maintained a greater degree of independence, the Warsaw Pact was deeply tied to the Soviet Union's central authority. Moscow didn't just coordinate the alliance, it commanded it. Troops were stationed under Soviet oversight. Exercises followed Soviet plans. And when countries tried to step outside the structure, the consequences came quickly. Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968. Both saw protests, reforms, movements toward freedom, and both were met with tanks, soldiers, silence. Under the banner of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union crushed uprisings in the name of unity. The alliance became, at times, a mask for enforcement, a way to keep the Eastern Bloc tightly aligned and firmly under control. To the outside world, the pact claimed to be a brotherhood of socialist nations. Inside, it often felt more like a boundary no one was allowed to cross. Still, the Warsaw Pact held together. For decades, it stood opposite NATO. Two massive alliances staring at each other across a tense, divided continent. Their very existence helped define the Cold War. Not through action, but through position. The idea that both sides were ready. That any conflict would not be local, but total. That everything, every border, every decision, every inch, might matter. And yet, despite the weight of its presence, the Warsaw Pact never fulfilled its purpose in a conventional war. It prepared, it trained, it postured, but it never invaded the West. Like NATO, it existed more as a deterrent than a tool. A looming presence meant to prevent the very war it was built to fight. By the late 1980s, cracks began to show. Reform movements grew. The grip of the Soviet Union weakened. And one by one, member states began to slip away. By 1991, the Warsaw Pact was gone. No final battle, no collapse in flames, just meetings, signatures, and silence. The alliance that had once seemed immovable vanished like the system it served. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet mirror to NATO, but it reflected more than just structure. It revealed how deeply the Soviet Union depended on its sphere of influence. How power, once shared under the word alliance, could so easily become something else, something more brittle, more fragile, and in the end, unsustainable. In Cold War history, the Warsaw Pact stood as both a shield and a symbol of Soviet strength, yes, but also of control, of pressure, and of the cost required to maintain a world divided by fear. And when it ended, it did so not with war, but with a long, slow unraveling, like ice melting in the quiet of spring. Khrushchev's shoe. Sometimes history is remembered not for the treaties signed or the borders drawn, but for a single moment, unexpected, vivid, and strangely human. In 1960, at the United Nations in New York City, such a moment occurred. It didn't involve weapons or declarations. It didn't change policy, but it captured something about the Cold War that words alone couldn't describe. Its tension, its theatrics, its deep frustration boiling just beneath the surface. The man at the center of it was Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, and a figure who, in many ways, embodied the contradictions of the Cold War. Charismatic, blunt, deeply political, sometimes unpredictable. Khrushchev had come to the UN General Assembly that year with strong opinions and no intention of remaining silent. The topic under debate was colonialism, specifically Soviet accusations that Western powers were maintaining imperialist control over newly emerging nations. It was a heated session. Voices rose, accusations flew. And then, according to many witnesses, Khrushchev removed his shoe, not carefully, not subtly, but with force, and began banging it on the table in front of him. A black leather shoe, heavy, ordinary, striking wood, over and over again. Some accounts say it was in protest of a speech by a delegate from the Philippines. Others suggest he was frustrated by how the discussion was unfolding, or perhaps by the tone of Western diplomats. Whatever the exact reason, the image of one of the world's most powerful men pounding his shoe in a room full of diplomats and translators quickly became a symbol of bluster, of anger, of the sheer absurdity that often accompanied Cold War diplomacy. But like so many things from that era, the moment is surrounded by mystery. No clear footage exists of the actual banging. Photographs show Khrushchev holding a shoe. Others show him gesturing. But whether he truly pounded the table with it, or merely waved it in the air, remains debated. Some Soviet officials later downplayed the story. Others confirmed it. Over time, the shoe became legend, half fact, half folklore. What's not debated, however, is what it meant. In that one moment, theatrical, emotional, strange, Khrushchev revealed something that official speeches and written declarations could never quite show. The raw nerves of the Cold War. The deep frustration that sat just beneath the polished surface of international diplomacy. The sense, on both sides, that words were often not enough. That posture, performance, even spectacle were part of the game. The shoe incident wasn't about violence. No one was harmed. No policies changed that day. But it became a shorthand, a way of describing the volatility of Cold War rhetoric, a reminder that behind the prepared statements and carefully managed summits, real emotions simmered. The leaders of the world were not just symbols. They were people, complex, proud, often under immense pressure. Khrushchev himself was a man of contradictions. He had denounced Stalin's brutality, yet held tightly to Soviet authority. He had threatened the West, and also proposed peaceful coexistence. He banged his shoe on a table, yet also sent grain to countries in need. Like the Cold War itself, he was a mix of danger and diplomacy, of fire and restraint. And so, the shoe, whether it hit the table or not, became something larger than itself. A symbol of a time when the world's future often seemed to rest not just in treaties or tanks, but in unpredictable moments, in the clash of personalities, in the drama of words and gestures played out on a world stage. The Cold War was full of moments like these, quiet, strange, symbolic, sometimes remembered clearly, sometimes distorted with time, but always reminding us that beneath the ideology and strategy, there were people. And sometimes, people bang on tables. Sometimes they use their fists. And sometimes, they use a shoe. The space race begins. The Cold War wasn't just fought on Earth. It reached beyond borders, beyond oceans, beyond the pull of gravity itself. In October 1957, that invisible conflict between East and West suddenly took flight, quietly, mechanically, and without warning, in the form of a small metal sphere that began to circle the Earth. Its name was Sputnik. Its sound, a simple radio beep. But what it represented was much more. Launched by the Soviet Union, Sputnik 1 was the first man-made object to enter orbit. Just under 2 feet wide, covered in polished aluminum, with 4 slender antennae trailing behind, it wasn't designed to do much. It didn't carry cameras. It didn't send back data. It simply transmitted a steady, pulsing signal, a rhythm that could be picked up by amateur radios and military stations alike. Beep, beep, beep. A heartbeat from space. A signal that humanity had left its home, even just a little, for the very first time. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph. Proof that their science, their engineers, their vision had reached further, faster. For the United States, it was a shock, a wake-up call. Overnight, newspapers called it the Sputnik crisis. Politicians spoke of a missile gap. Citizens looked up at the sky, uneasy. Because if the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, what else could they launch? Thus began the space race, not just a competition of technology, but of ideology, of who would define the future. Space became more than vacuum and stars. It became a stage, a scoreboard, a canvas on which to project power and pride. Both nations poured resources into rocketry. New agencies were born. In the United States, NASA was created in 1958, not as a weapon, but as a peaceful civilian answer to a growing challenge. The early years moved quickly. Just a month after Sputnik, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, this time with a passenger, Laika, a dog from the streets of Moscow. She became the first living creature to orbit Earth. She didn't return, but her journey proved what had once been unthinkable, that life could survive in space, even briefly. Each launch became a statement, each orbit a message. Satellites mapped the Earth, rockets tested limits, probes reached for the moon. The pace was relentless, and every success raised the stakes. Schools adapted. Science and math took center stage in classrooms across America. The next generation was being trained to reach higher, because reaching higher had become a matter of national purpose. But beyond the rivalry, something else began to emerge, a quiet awe. For the first time, humans were seeing the Earth from beyond. A tiny sphere, blue and glowing, suspended in blackness, fragile, whole. And in those moments, as Sputnik circled silently, as other satellites followed, the Cold War's boundaries began to feel smaller than they once had. The space race would continue to escalate. First satellite, first animal, first human, first spacewalk, and eventually, the moon. But it all began with that single launch, that small sphere beeping overhead, and the world below, listening. The Cold War had found a new frontier, not to conquer, but to reach, to prove not just military strength, but imagination, ingenuity, endurance. And even in the silence of orbit, there was meaning, a quiet revolution that changed how we see the sky and ourselves. One man, first. On the morning of April 12, 1961, just before dawn, a young Soviet pilot sat quietly inside a narrow metal capsule. His name was Yuri Gagarin. He was 27 years old, a lieutenant, a father, a dreamer. And in that moment, he was about to become the first human being to leave the Earth. Outside the capsule, the world remained asleep. The launch pad sat deep in the steppes of Kazakhstan, far from cities, far from cameras. The rocket, named Vostok 1, stood tall, silent, and ready. The mission had been prepared in secret. Its risks were immense, but the decision had been made. The Cold War had reached the edge of space, and now a single man would cross it. At 9:07 a.m. local time, the engines ignited. Gagarin's voice, calm and steady, spoke the word that would echo through history. Poyekali. Let's go. The rocket lifted into the sky with a force never before felt by human muscle. It climbed, faster than sound, piercing the clouds, leaving Earth behind. And then, silence. The weight lifted, the pressure fell away, and for the first time in history, a person looked down upon the planet from space. He orbited the Earth once, just once. The entire flight lasted 108 minutes. But in that hour and a half, something changed. Not just for the Soviet Union, or for the United States, but for everyone. Humanity had stepped into the unknown. The barrier of atmosphere, once unbreakable, had opened. And on the other side was not chaos, but calm. Inside the capsule, Gagarin reported seeing the curvature of the Earth. He described its colors, the deep blues, the shadows of clouds, the thinness of the atmosphere, like a delicate halo around a fragile world. There were no borders, no nations, just land, water, and light. A planet floating in the dark, home to everything we know. When he returned, he landed not in a city or a base, but in a field. A farmer and her daughter saw him parachuting down. He was smiling. His suit gleamed silver in the morning sun. He told them not to be afraid. He said, "I am a Soviet citizen, like you. I've just come back from space." The moment was more than symbolic. It was seismic. The Soviet Union had won this round of the space race. For a moment, the world stopped, not to argue, but to marvel. Newspapers rushed to print his face. Millions celebrated. Children learned his name. And even in the West, behind layers of rivalry, there was admiration, because no matter where you stood on Earth, the fact remained. One of us had left. Yuri Gagarin became a global hero. He toured the world, waving to crowds, shaking hands with presidents and kings. But he remained humble. He often said he wasn't alone up there, that he carried all of humanity with him. He didn't fly as a soldier. He flew as a human being. And that, perhaps, is the quiet wonder of his journey. That in the height of the Cold War, when suspicion ran deep and borders felt hard and high, this single orbit reminded the world how small and interconnected we really are. He flew not to conquer, but to witness. Not to stake a claim, but to open a door. Yuri Gagarin was the first, but he would not be the last. Because after that flight, the sky was no longer the limit. It was the beginning. Eyes in the sky. As the Cold War stretched into its second decade, something began to change. Not on the ground, but above it. Silent objects, barely larger than a car, began to drift through the sky. No sound, no smoke, just motion, quiet, methodical, steady. These were satellites, and they were the new watchers in the Cold War's long, slow game of anticipation. It started with Sputnik, yes, but after those first, symbolic launches, both the United States and the Soviet Union began turning their attention to what these orbiting machines could actually do. They could listen, they could map, they could see, and soon they could spy. The earliest reconnaissance satellites were primitive. Film had to be dropped from space in sealed canisters and caught mid-air by aircraft before it could be developed. The technology was clunky, experimental, and expensive. But it worked. The black and white photographs that came back revealed airfields, missile silos, tank formations, information once hidden behind miles of land and layers of secrecy. And so, the skies became a new frontier of intelligence. The age of satellites was born. From hundreds of miles above, both sides monitored each other constantly. A nation's troop movements, nuclear facilities, or even the placement of a radar station could be studied in quiet detail, all without a single border being crossed. The intelligence wasn't perfect, but it was powerful. And for a war built on uncertainty, it changed everything. These eyes in the sky gave leaders something they'd never had before: real-time visibility into their rivals' capabilities. It didn't end mistrust, far from it, but it allowed for a new kind of balance. Decisions could be based on more than rumor or fear. There were photos now, data, proof. And in a war where the greatest danger was misunderstanding, satellites brought something that resembled clarity. But they also brought paranoia. Each side assumed the other was watching, that every movement might be recorded, that every launch, every maneuver, every structure, no matter how remote, was being seen by someone somewhere, floating silently above. And so began a quiet race to hide in plain sight. Decoys were used, bunkers built underground, missiles were moved under cover of night. In some cases, entire fake towns were constructed just to confuse the watchers. It became a game of shadows, played in daylight, visible from space. Eventually, satellites evolved beyond surveillance. They began to support communication, to guide submarines and aircraft, to track weather and environmental changes. The very tools born from Cold War rivalry slowly began helping the world in broader ways. A strange irony that technologies developed in the name of division became tools for understanding. But during those decades of high tension, the primary purpose was always strategic: quiet observation, quiet confirmation, quiet warning. They didn't carry weapons, they didn't drop bombs, but they changed how war was prepared for and how peace was preserved. Because sometimes the most powerful thing isn't what a satellite can do, but what it can see and what seeing prevents. The skies of the Cold War were never empty. Even on the calmest nights, above the clouds and moonlight, machines circled silently, blinking their red lights, gathering their images, whispering their coordinates to rooms far below, watching and waiting. And in that watching, in that stillness, the Cold War's most enduring tension found its quietest form, a stare that never blinked, from 200 miles above. Mutually assured destruction. At the heart of the Cold War, deeper than ideology, deeper than politics or geography, was one haunting truth. Both sides had the power to end the world. Not symbolically, not economically, literally. The United States and the Soviet Union each built weapons capable of wiping out entire cities in moments. Bombs that didn't just destroy, but erased. Light, heat, silence, ash. And each side had thousands of them. This fragile, terrifying balance became known by 3 words: mutually assured destruction, a phrase so blunt, so stark, that its acronym, MAD, almost seemed like a warning in itself. The idea was simple, and yet profoundly unsettling. If one superpower launched a nuclear attack, the other would respond with equal force. No one would survive. No one would win. It wasn't a strategy meant to defeat the enemy. It was a promise that if war began, it would end everything. This doctrine, never formally signed but deeply understood, shaped every military decision of the Cold War. It changed how countries built their weapons, where they placed them, and how quickly they could use them. Submarines carried warheads beneath the ocean, undetectable, ready to retaliate if the homeland was lost. Bombers circled in the sky, fueled and waiting. Missile silos sat buried in farmlands and forests, their quiet presence known only to those who counted launch codes and rehearsed impossible decisions. And with them came systems of warning, radar, satellites, early detection lines stretching from Alaska to Greenland. Because timing mattered, a single false alarm could set everything in motion, and so dozens of people, in bunkers, in towers, at glowing screens, watched the skies, 24 hours a day, hoping to never see the signal they were trained to respond to. The logic behind mutually assured destruction was chillingly effective. Because each side feared the total annihilation of the other, both were deterred from firing first. The best way to maintain peace was to make the cost of war unthinkable. It created a world suspended in high tension, not hot with conflict, but frozen in readiness. But it wasn't without risks. There were moments, terrifying, real moments, when systems malfunctioned, when radar picked up birds or satellites or clouds and mistook them for missiles. In those brief windows, a handful of people held the weight of the world in their hands: commanders, technicians, generals. And in each case, someone chose not to act, not to launch, not to trust the signal, and history, unknowingly, exhaled. The psychological toll of this balance was immense. Children practiced duck and cover drills in classrooms. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. Films and books imagined the end, often not as a slow collapse, but as a flash, a roar, and a silence that stretched forever. The future became something that could disappear in minutes. And yet, in its grim way, mutually assured destruction worked. It forced caution. It slowed decisions. It made war too dangerous to risk. The great powers remained locked in competition, in proxy battles, in posturing and politics. But they never crossed the final line. Some saw it as madness. Others saw it as necessary. A peace kept not by trust, but by terror. A world preserved not by hope, but by the fear of what could be lost. And in that fear, oddly, there was order. For decades, the earth spun quietly under arsenals that could destroy it. And somehow, it kept spinning. The voice of America. While missiles stood silent and soldiers waited behind borders, the Cold War also unfolded in a quieter place, across radio waves. Invisible, unarmed, and constant, broadcasts became one of the most powerful tools of influence during the Cold War. Among them was one voice in particular, soft, persistent, and clear. It was called the Voice of America. It began in 1942, during World War II, with a simple promise: the news may be good or bad, but we shall tell you the truth. That message, spoken in German to those living under Nazi control, would become the foundation for decades of broadcasting to places where truth was controlled, shaped, or censored. As the Cold War deepened, the Voice of America became a kind of bridge, carrying not soldiers, but stories, not orders, but ideas. Broadcast from studios in Washington, D.C., its signal reached across oceans and continents, bouncing off the atmosphere and arriving in kitchens, bedrooms, and garages far from the American coast. It was never flashy. It didn't shout. It played music. It read the news. It offered context, analysis, and conversation. And most of all, it let people hear something they couldn't always access: an alternate perspective. In places where state media controlled every headline and paper, these broadcasts became a window. The Voice of America aired jazz concerts when jazz was banned. It interviewed dissidents when their voices were silenced at home. It reported on elections, protests, civil rights movements, scientific breakthroughs, sometimes ordinary stories, sometimes history in the making, but always with the same goal: to offer information that might otherwise remain hidden. And it wasn't alone. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty joined the airwaves too, broadcasting into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union with the support of the US government, but presented in local languages, by voices that listeners could relate to. These stations didn't push propaganda. They told stories. They asked questions. And in doing so, they chipped away, slowly, gently, at walls of silence. In East Berlin, in Budapest, in Prague and Moscow, people listened in secret. Radios tucked under pillows, volumes turned low, tuning through static to find that one familiar voice, speaking a language they knew, in a tone that felt honest. Some recordings were shared. Some were transcribed by hand. The broadcasts became more than news. They became hope, a sign that someone, somewhere, was speaking into the darkness, and that someone else was listening. But it wasn't without risk. In many countries behind the Iron Curtain, listening to Western broadcasts was forbidden. Radios were sometimes jammed, flooded with noise to make foreign voices unintelligible. In some places, even being caught tuning in could raise suspicion. And yet, people did. Night after night. Because when words are scarce, even static can carry meaning. Over time, the technology changed. Shortwave gave way to FM. The jamming stopped. The Cold War began to thaw. But the voice of America never stopped broadcasting. It had outlived the very tension that gave it purpose. And perhaps that was the point. In a war defined by silence, secrecy, and suspicion, its power was simple. It spoke, not loudly, not perfectly, but consistently. In a time when borders were sealed and ideologies clashed, the air itself remained free, carrying stories, questions, and music across boundaries no wall could hold. And for millions of listeners, those distant voices became something deeply personal, a reminder that no matter where they lived, they weren't alone. Someone was still telling the truth. Defection, one by one. During the Cold War, the most dramatic moves didn't always come from armies or leaders. Sometimes the most powerful moments were quiet, a single decision made in silence, carried out in secrecy. These were the defections, men and women who chose to walk away from one world and enter another, not in protest, not in open rebellion, but in whispers, in calculated escape, one by one. To defect meant more than just crossing a border. It meant leaving behind everything familiar: family, language, country, and identity. And it often meant doing so with no guarantee of safety or success. It was a leap into the unknown, driven by desperation, conviction, or the simple, aching need to be free. Some defected for political reasons: dissidents, thinkers, people who questioned too loudly or refused to conform, writers whose words were censored, scientists whose discoveries were watched too closely. Others defected because they could no longer live under surveillance, in systems where privacy was scarce and freedom was controlled not only by law, but by fear. And some were part of the very machinery of control itself: diplomats, agents, military officers, people who had once enforced the rules and then chose to escape them. The methods varied: a sprint across a border, a forged passport, a late-night meeting with a foreign contact, a carefully timed flight to a neutral country. In Berlin, some swam canals, others tunneled under fences or hid in car trunks. Each defection carried risk, not just for the defector, but for anyone they might leave behind. Families were questioned, friends watched, neighbors asked to explain, and still, people left. For the West, high-profile defections were political gold. They were proof that the Iron Curtain couldn't hold everyone in, that the system behind it was not as stable as it claimed to be. Some defectors were celebrated, welcomed with press conferences, offered new homes, new jobs, sometimes even new names. But others faded into anonymity, living quiet lives, marked by the choice they had made, always looking over their shoulder, wondering what was still following them. In the East, defectors were portrayed as traitors, betrayers, people corrupted by Western lies. And yet, the state worked tirelessly to prevent more from leaving. Borders were tightened, exit visas restricted, travel abroad carefully monitored. Because while one person crossing a border might seem small, each defection cast doubt, and in the Cold War, doubt was dangerous. Some of the most famous cases read like spy novels: pilots who flew their fighter jets across enemy lines, scientists smuggled out under cover of night, KGB agents who turned over briefcases of secrets in exchange for a new life. But for every dramatic case, there were hundreds more we never heard about: students, workers, parents, people who simply wanted to live differently. Defection wasn't just escape, it was transformation. It often meant learning a new language, adapting to a new culture, starting again with nothing. Some defectors never truly felt at home in their new countries. Others became symbols of resilience and courage, but none could return. Defection was a door that closed behind them. And yet, even as both sides tried to manage the flow of people, the defections never stopped entirely. They came in waves, in trickles, in moments of opportunity. They reminded the world that no matter how strong a system may seem from the outside, its strength depends on the willingness of its people to remain within it. In a world divided by walls and ideology, defection was a quiet rebellion. Not with fists, but with footsteps. A single person choosing another life. A message that could not be jammed or censored or denied. One by one, they left. And the Cold War followed them, quietly, wherever they went. The Berlin Wall rises. Berlin was already divided, not by law, but by circumstance. Since the end of World War II, it had been a city split into sectors, American, British, French in the West, and Soviet in the East. Each zone operated under a different set of values, different systems, and increasingly, different futures. For years, it remained possible to move between the two, across a street, a bridge, a station. People commuted, visited relatives, walked into the other side with little more than a glance. But all around that freedom, pressure was building. As the Cold War deepened, the contrast between East and West Berlin became sharper. In the West, shops reopened, investment returned, and a sense of normalcy began to take shape. In the East, the government, under Soviet influence, emphasized collective industry, centralized planning, and surveillance. While some adapted, many left. By the late 1950s, the flow of people moving from east to west had become a quiet crisis. Teachers, engineers, doctors, students, thousands were slipping away every month. It wasn't just an embarrassment for East Germany, it was a threat to its stability. Then, in the early hours of August 13th, 1961, everything changed. Under the cover of darkness, soldiers and workers began unrolling barbed wire across the city. Roads were blocked, rail lines were cut, bridges sealed. By sunrise, Berlin was no longer just divided, it was enclosed. What had once been a line on a map had become real, physical, sharp. In the days that followed, the wire was replaced with concrete. Tall grey slabs rose through neighborhoods, across plazas, even through cemeteries. Entire blocks were cut in half. Families woke to find they were now on opposite sides of a wall they never saw coming. Doors that once opened onto other streets were bricked shut. Windows facing the west were sealed. Soldiers stood guard. Watchtowers rose. And soon, Berlin had become a city inside a cage. The East German government called it an anti-fascist protective barrier. But the world saw it differently. To most, it was a prison wall, not built to keep invaders out, but to keep people in. For those trapped in the East, it was a sudden, jarring silence. Life continued, but under a new shadow. Leaving became nearly impossible. Crossing the border was an act of defiance, and those who tried often paid the price. Some were captured, others were killed. The space between two streets became a deadly no man's land, watched, patrolled, feared. And yet, the wall didn't silence everyone. Some dug tunnels, some crafted escape balloons, some ran, climbed, or bribed their way through. A few made it, many didn't. But with each attempt, the wall's message was challenged, that people could be contained, that movement could be stopped. The wall stood as a symbol, yes, of division, of ideology, of control, but it also became a symbol of the human desire to resist. On one side of the wall, life moved freely. On the other, it moved carefully. Everything on the eastern side, from newspapers to neighbors, carried the weight of surveillance. In the West, people looked toward the wall and saw tragedy. In the East, many looked toward it and felt absence, of family, of opportunity, of choice. The Berlin Wall would stand for nearly 3 decades. It would outlast leaders, survive crises, and become one of the most enduring images of the Cold War. But it would also carry a quiet cost, measured not only in lives lost, but in the dreams interrupted, the reunions delayed, the freedom withheld. It rose quickly, but it would not stand forever. The Stasi watches. In East Germany, Beyond the grey buildings, behind quiet doors, and beneath the rhythm of ordinary life, there was something always present, not seen, but always felt. It was called the Ministry for State Security, but everyone knew it by a simpler name, the Stasi. To the outside world, East Germany was a small satellite state, loyal to the Soviet Union, sealed behind the Iron Curtain. But on the inside, it became one of the most tightly surveilled societies in modern history. The Stasi was more than a security agency. It was an institution built on suspicion and the quiet belief that control could be maintained not just by force, but by watching. The numbers are staggering. At its height, the Stasi employed over 90,000 full-time officers. But more chilling than that were the informants, everyday citizens recruited to report on others. Teachers, neighbors, clergy, co-workers, even children. Estimates suggest that nearly 1 in every 6 East Germans had, at some point, provided information to the secret police. And most of it wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. A comment made over dinner. A book someone borrowed. A person who arrived home later than expected. It didn't take much to attract attention. The Stasi built massive archives, miles of paper files, audio recordings, photographs, even smells catalogued in jars for identification by dogs. They opened letters. They recorded phone calls. They placed microphones in apartments, hidden behind walls, light switches, furniture. Their goal wasn't only to know everything, it was to make people believe they knew everything. And it worked. In East Germany, trust became a fragile thing. People learned not to speak freely. Even in private, jokes could be dangerous. A shared opinion might end up in a report. And those who spoke too openly, artists, activists, teachers, were often visited, questioned, or quietly punished. Some lost jobs, others were imprisoned, a few disappeared. But the true power of the Stasi wasn't violence. It was silence. It was the fear that someone, somewhere, was always listening. And so people changed how they lived. They folded their thoughts inward. They avoided eye contact. They taught their children not to ask certain questions. And in time, the surveillance didn't just monitor behavior, it shaped it. There were those who resisted, quietly and carefully. Underground writers, musicians who sang about freedom in metaphors, people who found small ways to be honest, even if only in the pages of a journal. But for many, resistance felt impossible. The weight of the system was heavy, and the watchers were everywhere. And then, in 1989, it ended. The wall fell. The regime collapsed. And for the first time, East Germans flooded into Stasi buildings, discovering the vast machinery that had once held them in check. Rooms filled with shredded paper, cabinets of photographs, rows and rows of names. People found files about themselves, hundreds of pages long. Some discovered who had informed on them. Others chose not to look. What the Stasi left behind wasn't just an archive. It was a reminder of how fragile privacy can be, how fear can grow quietly day by day, not through war or violence, but through the slow erosion of trust, and how a society, when watched too closely, can forget how to breathe. The Stasi did not need to knock down doors every night. It only needed to make people believe that it could. That belief, that possibility, was enough. In the Cold War's long shadow, it remains one of the quietest and most powerful tools of control ever built. And in its silence, it left echoes that still haven't fully faded. Music finds a way. Even behind the thickest walls and strictest borders, sound has a way of slipping through. And during the Cold War, in the most unlikely places, in rooms with drawn curtains, in basements with cracked radios, in youth clubs, in whispered conversations, music became something more than entertainment. It became a quiet rebellion, a thread of freedom, a reminder of life beyond the curtain. In the Eastern Bloc, particularly in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union. Western music was often seen as dangerous. It wasn't just about the lyrics. It was about the sound, the rhythm, the energy, the sense of movement, rock and roll, jazz, blues, soul. These genres carried with them not only foreign instruments and styles, but foreign ideas, individualism, emotion, defiance, the ability to question, to feel, to dream out loud. Governments labeled this music as decadent or subversive. Western records were banned, radio stations were tightly controlled, but still, the music came. Through static-filled broadcasts like Radio Free Europe or Voice of America, late at night, when the airwaves were quieter and the jamming signals weaker, young people would tune in, adjusting their antennas just right, trying to catch a single clear song before the noise returned. Some smuggled records across borders. Some copied cassette tapes over and over until the sound barely held together. Others wrote down lyrics by hand, passing them like poems. The covers were sometimes blank, the tapes unlabeled, but the music spoke anyway. It didn't need a name, it just needed to be heard. In the Soviet Union, bootleggers found creative ways to reproduce forbidden tracks. They etched records into old X-ray film, fragile, ghostly discs nicknamed bone music. You could see a ribcage or a skull faintly behind the grooves of a jazz song. These records were illegal, of course, but they played anyway, on worn-out turntables, at parties that felt like resistance. And slowly, the music began to change things. In East Germany, young people formed underground bands, blending their own language with Western sound. In Poland, students gathered in secret to listen and dance. In Hungary, state-run labels began releasing softened versions of rock music, hoping to offer a controlled outlet before the real thing took hold. But the energy couldn't be contained, because music, at its core, doesn't follow orders. It pulses. It insists. Even the authorities began to realize this. Some cracked down harder. Others tried to co-opt the style, allowing only acceptable music, with lyrics that aligned with the party line. But the real power of these sounds wasn't in the words, it was in the feeling. The backbeat, the guitar riff. The moment when someone, young, restless, curious, heard something that made them feel alive. In a world where speech was monitored, where newspapers spoke only what they were allowed to say, music was one of the few things that could still feel free. A song could travel where people could not. It could suggest what couldn't be said out loud. It could make you move, even when you were being told to sit still. And while no single song brought the Cold War down, the music mattered. It softened edges. It stirred questions. It gave a generation something they didn't always have. A sense of identity not given to them by the state, but discovered on their own. By the time the wall fell and the systems changed, the music had already done part of the work. It had planted the idea that there was something else, some other rhythm, beyond the one everyone was expected to follow. Because even when words are censored, even when borders are sealed, music still finds a way. The red phone. There's a popular image, carried from film to memory. A red telephone, sitting on the desk of a world leader, glowing silently until it rings with history-changing urgency. It's dramatic, immediate, a symbol of tension at its highest point. But like many Cold War images, it's only half true. There was no red phone, not exactly. But the idea behind it was very real, and it came from a moment when silence nearly became catastrophe. In October 1962, the world came close to ending. For 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis held the planet in suspended breath. Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered on Cuban soil, just 90 miles from the US coast. American naval ships formed a blockade. Planes circled. Missiles were readied. Leaders on both sides faced unimaginable pressure. And while the crisis was eventually diffused through letters, proposals, and a delicate compromise, one terrifying truth became clear. Communication had been too slow. Messages took hours to travel. Translations delayed them further. By the time a response was delivered, the world could have already changed. The Cold War didn't need more weapons. It needed a way for its most powerful leaders to speak quickly, clearly, and directly before misunderstandings became history. So, in the summer of 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to install something new, a hotline. It wasn't a telephone, and it wasn't red. It was a teletype line, a direct, secure connection between Washington and Moscow. Not for daily use, not for casual messages. It was designed for moments when time mattered most, when assumptions could be fatal. Over time, the system would be upgraded, first to fax, later to email. But its purpose remained unchanged, to prevent a war of silence. The hotline didn't eliminate tension. It didn't stop arms races or proxy wars. But it offered something rare in the Cold War, a moment of human contact in a conflict shaped by distance. It gave each side the ability to reach across that distance in an instant, not with threats, but with words. And sometimes, that's all that was needed. The existence of the hotline became a symbol in itself, of restraint, of the fragile understanding that even in the worst moments, there had to be a path away from destruction. It was a recognition that behind all the military plans, the speeches, the maps and missiles, there were people. And people, when given the chance, could still choose dialogue over disaster. Over the years, the hotline was used sparingly, during conflicts in the Middle East, during tense military exercises, even during periods of political transition. Most of those messages were never made public. They weren't grand declarations or ultimatums. They were careful, quiet signals sent in moments of uncertainty. And they may have saved lives, simply by being sent. The red phone may never have existed as we imagined it. But the idea behind it, that in the darkest hour, a voice could still be heard, was as real as anything built during the Cold War. And perhaps, in a time defined by walls, silos, and suspicion, that simple connection, not of wires, but of intention, was one of the war's most important inventions, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October of 1962, the world held its breath. For 13 days, the planet hovered closer to nuclear war than it ever had before, and perhaps closer than it ever will again. It began not with an explosion, but with photographs. Quiet, grainy images taken from the sky by an American U-2 reconnaissance plane. On the surface of Cuba, barely 90 miles from Florida's coast, those images showed what no one wanted to believe: Soviet missile bases, under construction, armed with nuclear capability, and aimed. The response was immediate, but it wasn't loud. It was tense. It was careful. US President John F. Kennedy and his advisors met behind closed doors, weighing options that ranged from full invasion to quiet diplomacy. On the other side of the world, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced his own pressure. To stand firm, to protect his ally Cuba, and to resist Western dominance in the Western Hemisphere. At the heart of it all was a frightening reality. Both leaders held the power to launch weapons that could destroy entire cities, and each knew that if one launched first, the other would follow. What began as a confrontation over missiles could end in the collapse of civilization itself. And that possibility, though never fully spoken aloud at the time, hung over every decision, every pause, every hour. Kennedy addressed the American people in a televised speech on October 22nd. His tone was measured, his words exact. He announced a quarantine, a naval blockade designed to prevent more Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba. US warships moved into position. Submarines were readied. Bombers took to the skies. Across the ocean, Soviet vessels approached the blockade line. For the next 6 days, the world watched. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills. In homes, families stocked pantries and listened to radios, waiting for updates that might never come. It wasn't just Americans or Soviets who were afraid. The entire world, it seemed, waited in collective silence, watching two great powers tiptoe at the edge of war. And then a message arrived. From Moscow came a letter, cautious, emotional. Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles if the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. Then a second letter followed, harder, more demanding, calling for US missiles in Turkey to be dismantled. The two messages seemed at odds. Time was running short. Kennedy chose to respond to the first letter, ignoring the second publicly, but addressing it privately. His brother, Robert Kennedy, met secretly with the Soviet ambassador to strike a deal, remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States would remove its missiles from Turkey. Quietly, later, with no public statement. The Soviets agreed. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the missile sites in Cuba would be dismantled. The crisis had ended. The blockade would be lifted. The war that nearly began never did. The Cuban Missile Crisis left scars. Trust between the superpowers remained fragile. But it also left a lesson that communication, even in tension, even between enemies, can hold back disaster. That diplomacy, however imperfect, can still matter more than threats. After the crisis, the two nations established the hotline, a direct link between Washington and Moscow, so that if the world ever came that close again, the delay of words would not become a cause for war. To this day, the Cuban Missile Crisis stands as the moment when the Cold War came closest to turning hot. When history balanced on the edge of destruction and, for once, stepped back. There were no bombs, no shots fired, just decisions made by people under extraordinary pressure, choosing caution over catastrophe. And in that quiet, we were spared the noise of what could have been. Spies in the fog, beneath the surface of treaties and speeches, under the slow rotation of satellites and the formal lines of national borders, the Cold War was alive with movement, quiet, invisible, and rarely spoken of. It moved not through armies, but through individuals, not in tanks, but in footsteps. The Cold War, perhaps more than any other conflict in history, was a war of intelligence. And its soldiers were spies. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't march in formation. They blended in, on trains, in embassies, in coffee shops and quiet parks. They carried briefcases, not rifles. Their battles were fought in whispers, in glances, in codes passed from hand to hand, carefully memorized and quickly forgotten. Their victories weren't parades. They were secrets never discovered. Both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in espionage. Intelligence agencies like the CIA and the KGB became powerful institutions, not only gathering information, but shaping how governments understood the world. They recruited operatives from everywhere: diplomats, students, translators, journalists, even people who never realized how valuable they were until someone approached them with a quiet offer. Some said yes for ideology, others for money, and some simply out of curiosity or fear. The tradecraft of espionage was meticulous. Messages hidden in hollow coins, microfilms sealed in matchboxes, tiny cameras disguised as pens, radio transmitters the size of a cigarette pack. In East Berlin, entire buildings were wired for listening. In Moscow, hotel rooms were bugged as routine. Every detail mattered. Every movement could mean exposure. And then there were the dead drops. Information passed without a word exchanged. A book left on a bench. A chalk mark on a wall. A newspaper folded in a specific way. In cities like Vienna, Berlin, and Washington, these quiet exchanges played out daily, unnoticed by most, but carrying enormous weight. One sentence, one map, one photograph could shift a nation's strategy. Some spies became legends. People like Aldrich Ames and Kim Philby, double agents who spent years feeding information to the other side. Their stories, once secret, now read like fiction. Layers of betrayal, carefully managed lies. Lives built around trust no one could see. But for every well-known spy, there were thousands whose names remain unknown. People who gathered fragments, filed reports, and disappeared into history. It was dangerous work. The stakes were high. Capture could mean decades in prison, or worse. And even for those who were never caught, the cost was often personal. A life spent in lies, constant paranoia, and the burden of never being entirely oneself. But it wasn't just about stealing secrets. Espionage was also about shaping perception, disinformation campaigns, propaganda, psychological operations, convincing the other side that you were stronger, or weaker, or about to strike. The line between truth and fiction was deliberately blurred, and in that fog, strategy took shape. The Cold War never erupted into full-scale conflict, and perhaps part of the reason is that so much was known, not through open channels, but through the eyes and ears hidden in plain sight. Spies helped maintain the balance. They prevented surprises. They warned of danger, and ironically, they may have helped preserve peace by making war too predictable to begin. To the outside world, the Cold War was a standoff, a long silence. But beneath that silence was movement of messages, identities, loyalties, and doubt. A fog where very little was as it seemed, and almost everything had another layer. And when the Cold War ended, much of that fog lifted. Files were opened, codes declassified, faces and names revealed. But many of the shadows remained, and many stories will never be fully known. Because some of the most important moments of the Cold War were never written down, only remembered by those who lived them. And even they were trained not to tell. Hollywood joins the Cold War. During the Cold War, ideas mattered just as much as armies. The battle wasn't only fought with missiles or maps, it was fought with stories. And nowhere told stories more powerfully than Hollywood. American cinema, already a global force before the Cold War began, now found itself in a strange new role. It wasn't asked to carry weapons, but it carried something else: influence. Its films reached across oceans, into embassies, into the homes of allies, and sometimes into the minds of rivals. Whether it meant to or not, Hollywood became part of the Cold War. Some of it was direct. Films about spies, traitors, communists in disguise, plots that mirrored headlines, villains drawn with broad strokes, ideologies simplified into good and evil, characters who stood for liberty, others who threatened it. There were movies that warned, not of distant enemies, but of what could already be among us. Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Manchurian Candidate, and Red Dawn didn't just entertain. They reflected fear, paranoia, the anxiety of not knowing who to trust or what might be hiding behind a familiar face. Even science fiction changed. Aliens no longer came just to explore. They came to conquer, or to convert. Sometimes they stood for communism. Sometimes they stood for capitalism. But always, they stood for something more than themselves. The monsters were metaphors. The battles were ideological. The spaceships were symbols. And yet, it wasn't all propaganda. Hollywood was never a single voice. For every film that reinforced fear, another questioned it. Directors explored the cost of suspicion, the weight of silence, the quiet suffering of those caught between loyalty and freedom. Some stories offered comfort, others offered critique, but all of them, even the most fantastical, carried the imprint of the time. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, real Cold War forces shaped what made it to the screen. The US government sometimes consulted on scripts, offering access to equipment or locations in exchange for subtle narrative nudges. The FBI and CIA occasionally weighed in, quietly encouraging certain themes. And during the height of McCarthyism, some filmmakers accused of communist sympathies were blacklisted. Their careers ended, their names erased. Stories they might have told were silenced before they could begin. But still, the films kept coming. Westerns, war stories, detective dramas. Even when they didn't name the Cold War, they carried its shadow. The idea of the lone hero, the importance of loyalty, the danger of the unknown. It was there, between the lines, flickering at 24 frames per second. And around the world, people watched. In the East, American films were rarely shown officially, but copies circulated anyway, smuggled, shared, whispered about. Viewers saw more than explosions or glamour. They saw streets that looked different, people who spoke freely, choices that didn't have to be approved. Whether accurate or not, Hollywood offered a glimpse of a world beyond the wall, a world where decisions seemed larger, freer, somehow possible. It wasn't perfect. Many films simplified, some misled, and not every movie mattered. But taken together, the cinema of the Cold War reflected something deeper, a culture grappling with fear, with hope, with change, trying to understand the moment through story. And when the Cold War finally ended, many of those stories remained, tucked in reels of film and shelves of scripts, each capturing a small piece of what it felt like to live under that long, invisible tension. Because in the Cold War, even fiction had a side, and every story, whether thrilling, tragic, or quietly strange, became part of the war no one wanted to fight: ping-pong diplomacy. In the early 1970s, the Cold War had grown tired. The speeches still echoed, the weapons still waited. But year after year, the tension remained frozen, rigid and unmoving. The United States and the People's Republic of China, once potential allies during World War II, had not spoken for decades. No trade, no ambassadors, no real contact. Two of the world's largest nations, strangers to each other, opposing systems, opposing histories, with a silence between them that felt impossible to break. But then, something unexpected happened. Something small, something fast, something round. A ping-pong ball. In April 1971, the US table tennis team was competing in Japan. The Chinese team was there too, behind a curtain of formality and politics. But one day, after a match, an American player named Glenn Cowan missed his team's bus and found himself standing alone. A Chinese player, Zhuang Zedong, saw him, smiled, and offered a gift. A silk-screen portrait of China's Huangshan Mountains. A simple gesture, no speech, no strategy, just kindness. The moment made headlines. Photographers snapped the handshake that followed, and within days an invitation arrived. The American team was asked to visit China, the first official US delegation in over 20 years. The news stunned the world. The trip wasn't political in appearance. There were no negotiations, no policy papers, just athletes, young, focused, a little nervous, shaking hands, playing matches, visiting schools and the Great Wall. But beneath the smiles and serves, something deeper was happening. Trust, once frozen, was beginning to thaw. President Richard Nixon, watching closely, saw an opening. Behind the scenes, quiet diplomatic efforts intensified, and just months later, in 1972, Nixon himself visited Beijing. A moment unthinkable only a year before. He met with Mao Zedong. He toured factories. He dined beside leaders once considered untouchable. And it all began with ping-pong. The term ping-pong diplomacy became shorthand for a rare truth. Sometimes, human connection can do what policy cannot. A handshake between athletes can ripple outward. A shared game can soften decades of division. And in a time when the world felt locked in opposition, a paddle and a ball became tools of diplomacy. It wasn't just a clever name. It was a reminder that nations are not only governments, they are people. And people, when given a moment to look past fear, can see each other more clearly. The visit didn't solve everything. Differences remained. Tensions continued. But the silence was broken. Dialogue had begun. Embassies would eventually open. Trade would resume. The Cold War would begin to shift, slowly, carefully, in a new direction. And all of it, in some small way, traced back to that moment between two athletes standing side by side in a gymnasium, exchanging gifts instead of warnings, and choosing, if only for a few minutes, to play. In the Cold War, not every breakthrough came from summits or missiles. Some came from movement, from rhythm, from a ball bouncing softly across a table, and a smile returned. Checkpoint Charlie. In the center of Berlin, along a street called Friedrichstrasse, there once stood a small white guardhouse, modest, plain. A wooden structure with a sign above it that read, "You are leaving the American sector." It didn't look like much, but for decades, this little outpost became one of the most recognizable symbols of the Cold War. Its name was Checkpoint Charlie. After World War II, Berlin was split into 4 sectors, and then 2, East and West, communist and capitalist. And although the Berlin Wall had closed nearly every crossing point between them, a few remained for diplomats, military personnel, and foreign visitors. Checkpoint Charlie was one of those rare crossings, the official gateway between American-occupied West Berlin and Soviet-controlled East Berlin. It wasn't just a border post, it was a line between worlds. On one side, life moved with relative freedom. Cars came and went. Western media, music, and color spilled into shops and streets. On the other, everything was watched. Movement required permits. Choices were limited. Every passage through the checkpoint was a negotiation, not always in words, but in posture, in silence, in the weight of the uniform on either side. And then, in October 1961, the quiet was broken. An American diplomat attempting to cross into East Berlin was stopped by East German guards. They demanded identification. The United States insisted that only Soviet officials had the right to question their personnel. What began as a disagreement became a crisis. Within hours, American tanks rolled toward Checkpoint Charlie. The Soviets responded in kind. For 16 hours, the two superpowers stood face to face, tanks aimed, engines running, soldiers watching from behind metal. The world watched too. It felt, again, like things might break, but they didn't. Eventually, the tanks pulled back. One by one, no shots were fired. The moment passed, but the memory of it lingered, because Checkpoint Charlie wasn't just a place, it was a possibility, a reminder that war, even world war, could begin with a single misstep on a quiet street in Berlin. In the years that followed, the checkpoint remained, watched by tourists, crossed by journalists, passed by spies and diplomats. It became a backdrop for escape attempts, some successful, others tragic. It became a symbol in films, in books, in photographs of soldiers standing motionless, shadows stretching across the pavement. And then, in 1989, it ended. The wall came down. People rushed through streets that once divided them, and Checkpoint Charlie, like the wall itself, lost its purpose. The guardhouse was removed. The barriers fell. What remained was a memory, small, white, and standing in the middle of a street that no longer divided a world. Today, a replica of the checkpoint still stands. It's a museum piece now. Tourists pose with actors dressed as guards. The danger is gone, replaced by curiosity. But the gravity of the place lingers. Because for decades, this was not a photo stop. It was a place where history held its breath. And for a few tense hours in 1961, Checkpoint Charlie wasn't just a gate. It was the edge of the Cold War, and behind every uniform was a finger resting just above a trigger that, thankfully, was never pulled. Reagan's famous words. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was changing, slowly, quietly, not with explosions or dramatic headlines, but with signals, small shifts in tone, in policy, in posture. The Soviet Union was no longer led by an iron grip, but by a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who spoke of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, reform. Tensions had cooled, but the wall still stood, dividing Berlin, dividing Germany, dividing the world. And then came a speech, simple, clear, and now unforgettable. It was June 12, 1987. US President Ronald Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin. Behind him, the concrete barrier of the Berlin Wall. Beyond that, the city's eastern half, still sealed, still silent. Reagan was not the first American leader to visit Berlin, and he wouldn't be the last. But this moment was different. The air was warm, a crowd gathered, cameras rolled, and Reagan, known for his measured voice and theatrical sense of timing, leaned into the microphone and addressed the man across that wall. His words, now etched into history, were simple. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't angry, but it cut through the atmosphere like a spark. A direct challenge, yet also a hopeful request. A moment of clarity in a world often tangled in diplomacy. For some, it sounded like theatre. For others, like prophecy. The reaction at first was mixed. Members of Reagan's own staff had debated whether to include the line at all. Some feared it was too provocative, too blunt. But Reagan insisted. He believed in saying what needed to be said, in naming the thing that everyone saw, but few dared to demand. And so, the words stayed. On the Soviet side, the response was cautious. Gorbachev did not reply with equal drama. He continued his reforms, his diplomacy, his quiet undoing of what decades of division had built. But the speech didn't go unheard. In the years that followed, the wall began to crack, not from Reagan's words alone, but from pressure building on all sides, from citizens marching in Leipzig, from Eastern Europeans choosing freedom, from a system straining to hold itself together. 2 years after the speech, in November 1989, the wall was opened, not torn down by decree, but chipped away by ordinary people with hammers, fists, and tears. The line Reagan had drawn with his voice was now dissolving in stone, and yet the speech remained, not because it caused the fall, but because it captured the feeling, the longing, the clarity of what needed to happen. The wall wasn't just concrete, it was everything the Cold War stood for: fear, division, control. And tearing it down, with policy, with pressure, with people, was how the Cold War would begin to end. Today, those words are remembered as a turning point, not of action, but of expression. A sentence, spoken plainly, that carried the weight of decades. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Not a command, not a threat, just a hope, given voice. That maybe, finally, the world could come together again. Détente. There were times in the Cold War when everything felt like pressure, rising, tightening, never quite released. But in the 1970s, after years of tension, escalation, and fear, a different kind of movement began. Not loud, not sudden, just a slow easing, a thawing of ice, a softening of language. The world began to breathe again, if only a little. That moment, that shift in atmosphere, was called détente. The word itself means release or relaxation, and that's exactly what it was. A release of the rigid postures both East and West had maintained for decades. After the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink, leaders on both sides began to understand the cost of silence, of miscalculation. No one wanted to get that close again. Détente wasn't peace, but it was a pause, a recognition that the Cold War couldn't stay so hot forever. The change wasn't just emotional, it was practical. The United States and the Soviet Union began talking, seriously. They signed arms control treaties, beginning with the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. These treaties didn't eliminate weapons, but they capped them, froze them, slowed the race, even if they couldn't stop it. More than weapons, détente brought diplomacy. In 1972, US President Richard Nixon visited Moscow, the first American president ever to do so. He met with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. They sat across from each other not as enemies, but as leaders who both knew the cost of mistrust. Together, they signed agreements not only on arms, but on science, trade, and space exploration. And that was the quiet beauty of détente. It allowed room for cooperation. American and Soviet scientists worked together. Cultural exchanges resumed. Ballets crossed borders. Astronauts and cosmonauts shared orbit aboard the Apollo-Soyuz mission, a symbolic handshake in space. Two spacecraft, launched from two ideologies, meeting in the silence above Earth. But détente wasn't easy. It had critics. In the West, some felt it rewarded Soviet repression. In the East, some saw it as temporary, a mask worn to hide continued control. And over time, the momentum faded. Events like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 brought tension back to the forefront. The Cold War's old rhythm returned, and the brief warmth cooled once again. Still, détente left something behind, a memory of what could be, a glimpse of another path, a reminder that even in the longest conflicts, there can be pauses, that even rivals can speak, that hostility does not have to be permanent. And for a while, the world remembered how that felt. Not victory, not surrender, just a release, a softening of shoulders, the space to think, to listen, to imagine a future where fear wasn't the only currency of power. In a war defined by ice, détente was the sound of water beginning to move again. Quiet, careful, but real. Nuclear briefcases. There are few objects in the Cold War more unsettling than a briefcase, ordinary in shape, unremarkable in appearance, and yet what it symbolized was anything but. Because in the United States and the Soviet Union alike, a small black case was carried at all times by someone standing just steps away from the head of state. It had a quiet name: the nuclear football in America, the Cheget in the Soviet Union. But its purpose was neither quiet nor ordinary. These briefcases held the keys to ending the world. Inside were not weapons, but access, authentication codes, communication devices, pre-planned response options. If the unthinkable happened, if a nuclear attack was detected or believed imminent, the president or premier could use this case to authorize retaliation. In that sense, it wasn't a weapon itself, but the final word before one was released. And that made it the heaviest object in the Cold War, even if it weighed no more than 10 pounds. In the US, the nuclear football followed the president everywhere, not just in times of tension, but always. On trips, in motorcades, across golf courses, beside the bed in a hotel. There was always an officer nearby, quiet, trained, ready to hand over the case if needed. Its contents were secure, coded, updated. No one could open it by accident. But if the moment came, the process could begin in seconds. In the Soviet Union, the Cheget worked differently but held the same gravity. It was connected to a wider network of command, including the defense minister and military chief. But still, it began with one leader, one decision, one signal. And once the signal was given, there would be no turning back. These briefcases weren't shown often. They rarely made the news. But they were always present. And just knowing that they existed, that at any given moment, two human beings carried the power to reshape the world in fire, was enough to alter how history unfolded. Because their presence did something subtle, they made war personal. The Cold War was often abstract, full of strategies and doctrines, maps and missiles, alliances and ideologies. But the briefcases reminded everyone that, in the end, it would come down to people. Not machines, not computers, not armies. Just one leader, confronted with a moment of impossible weight, holding an object that no one should ever have to open. It's said that more than once, systems sent false warnings, that radar picked up shadows, that alarms were triggered by error. And in those moments, someone had to decide, is this real? Is this the moment? Should the case be opened? Each time, the answer was no. Each time, someone chose to wait. And that waiting may have saved everything. The briefcases were never used, but they were never forgotten. They became symbols of a strange kind of peace. One kept not by trust, but by the unbearable cost of failure. They still exist today, in newer forms, carried by new generations. But the Cold War gave them their meaning. In a world balanced on a wire, the briefcases held the weight of silence. And every day they stayed closed was a day the world kept spinning. Science races on. The Cold War is often remembered for what it threatened to destroy: cities, lives, nations. But quietly, in the long shadow of fear, it also gave rise to something else: progress. As the superpowers watched each other from across oceans and walls, they also pushed each other forward. In labs, in universities, in factories and fields, science surged ahead, not in spite of the Cold War, but because of it. Much of it began with urgency. Each side believed that survival depended not just on military strength, but on knowledge. Who could build faster, compute quicker, see farther, hear more? Scientific achievement became a kind of power, a way of claiming the future before the other side arrived there first. Computers were one of the clearest examples. Early machines, once the size of rooms, grew faster and smaller through Cold War innovation. Code breaking, surveillance, missile guidance, all pushed the limits of what machines could do. The groundwork for modern computing, for the phone in your hand, for the networks we now live within, began quietly with Cold War calculations. Medicine too advanced. Both sides raced to develop vaccines to protect soldiers and citizens alike. In the Soviet Union, mass campaigns eliminated diseases in record time. In the United States, polio was fought with urgency. The pressure of competition turned into public health, a strange, hopeful side effect of a conflict built on fear. And then there was space, the ultimate scientific battleground. Rockets built for war became tools for exploration. Satellites once meant to spy on each other began to map weather, guide ships, and connect the world. The moon, once distant and untouchable, was suddenly a target, not for conquest, but for arrival. And when astronauts finally stepped onto its surface in 1969, it wasn't just a victory for one side. It was a reminder that science, even under pressure, could reach beyond borders. But progress didn't stop at rockets and machines. Environmental science grew. Climatology, oceanography, even seismology expanded rapidly, often as side efforts to track missile tests or detect underground explosions. The more each side tried to monitor the Earth, the more they began to understand it. And slowly, a deeper realization took hold. This planet, no matter how divided its people, is still one system. Fragile, shared, and finite. Not all scientific advances during the Cold War were peaceful, of course. Many were born from defense, but many found their way into everyday life, from microwave ovens and GPS to artificial limbs and the internet itself. The line between military research and civilian benefit blurred, and sometimes, something beautiful emerged from something built to protect or destroy. What's often forgotten is that scientists too felt the tension. Many worked under pressure, under secrecy, under orders they didn't always believe in. Some defected, some resisted, but many simply kept working, believing that knowledge, even in a divided world, was still worth pursuing. And so, through the Cold War's long silence and steel, science raced on. Not always with kindness, not always with peace, but always forward, propelled by the strange, unrelenting gravity of competition. In a war built on fear of what the other side might do, both sides built things. that neither could have imagined alone. Children of the Cold War. In the towering scale of the Cold War, the missiles, the summits, the walls and war rooms, it's easy to forget who lived beneath it all. Not the soldiers, not the leaders, but the children. Millions of them, growing up in a world shaped by fear, surrounded by tension they didn't create, yet carried with them anyway, quietly, every day. In classrooms across the United States, children practiced duck and cover drills. At the sound of a bell or siren, they would dive beneath their desks, hands clasped over their necks, eyes shut tight. The idea was to prepare for a nuclear strike, as if a wooden desk could protect against fire and ash. But the drills weren't really about safety. They were about readiness, about teaching fear in manageable pieces, about making the impossible feel like routine. In the Soviet Union, children sang patriotic songs. They learned about enemies beyond the border, capitalist threats, and the glories of socialism. They studied science and math with purpose, not just to understand the world, but to compete with it. They were told they were part of a great struggle, a global game of survival. Their future, they were taught, was to outlast the West. On both sides, toys carried messages. In the US, action figures wore camouflage. In the USSR, picture books told stories of sacrifice and loyalty. Television shows were shaped by what could and could not be said. Even bedtime stories, simple as they seemed, often carried echoes of the larger world outside, of spies, of secrets, of heroes standing alone against the unknown. And yet, children found joy. They always do. They rode bicycles through divided streets. They whispered secrets in playground corners. They traded stamps, collected marbles, learned to skate and sing. In the smallest spaces, they found freedom, even when the world around them was defined by borders. Some grew up near walls. In Berlin, children on one side could hear the sounds of the other, voices, laughter, radios playing songs in a different language. The wall was always there, looming, but childhood has a way of making even concrete feel temporary. There were games played in its shadow. There were friendships that reached across it, even if only in dreams. And for those in countries caught between the two powers, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in divided families, childhood was often shaped by silence. What you could say, what you couldn't, what your parents whispered when they thought you weren't listening. Children always listen. But there was also hope. In books passed hand to hand, in letters smuggled across borders, in the music that crackled across the radio late at night. Many children grew up to question the world they'd inherited. Some became protesters, some became artists, some became leaders who would later tear down the very structures they once memorized in textbooks. The Cold War raised generations who knew what it meant to live with uncertainty, to hear words like nuclear, espionage, and containment before they could fully understand them. But it also raised children who believed in the possibility of change, because they had grown up in the quiet spaces between what was and what could be. And maybe that's the most powerful legacy of all. Because in a world divided by ideology, the children reminded us, without knowing it, what we all shared: a need for safety, a space to dream, and a future that didn't have to look like the past. The Cold War goes underground. While satellites circled high above and bombers soared across distant skies, much of the Cold War happened beneath the surface. Literally. Underground, where concrete met soil, where secrets were buried deep, where the world prepared for a war it hoped would never come. It was quiet there, cold, controlled. But in the depths of the earth, both superpowers built their shadow world, a mirror to the one above, designed not to thrive, but to survive. In the United States, fallout shelters dotted neighborhoods, small concrete bunkers built in basements, backyards, and government buildings. Some were stocked with canned goods and water, others with radiation meters, cots, hand-crank radios. The idea was simple: If nuclear war came, people would retreat below ground and wait. Wait days, weeks, longer if needed. Safety would lie in silence, in patience, in walls thick enough to hold back the end. The government had its own plans. Deep beneath mountains, inside hardened bunkers, command centers were built. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, operated from inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, behind blast doors that weighed 25 tons. Entire cities could disappear, and yet orders could still be given. Radars still read, satellites still tracked. Continuity of government, continuity of war. And the Soviet Union had its own mirror image. Vast tunnel systems under Moscow, rumored networks of secret trains, shelters for top officials carved into bedrock. Some civilians had access to public fallout shelters, while others were expected to shelter at home. But like the West, the East built with the same quiet urgency, assuming that one day everything above might vanish and whatever was left would begin here, underground. Submarines too became part of this hidden layer. Not beneath cities, but beneath oceans. Nuclear-powered and heavily armed, they glided silently through the darkest waters, untraceable, untouchable, always waiting. They could stay submerged for months, undetected, a moving launch pad for missiles. They were called second strike weapons, a grim reassurance that even if a country was destroyed, it could still respond from beneath the sea. Even culture went underground. In Eastern Europe, forbidden books were passed in secret. Samizdat, underground publishing, kept ideas alive when official voices were silent. In basements and kitchens, typewriters clicked through the night. Philosophy, poetry, banned histories, not shouted, but shared. Hidden words for hidden minds. And then there were the tunnels, carved not for shelter, but for escape. In Berlin, dozens of secret passages were dug beneath the wall. Some were simple. Others were elaborate, reinforced with wood and steel, wide enough to crawl through, dark and narrow and fragile. They carried not soldiers, but families. Not weapons, but hope. In the war of stone and silence, these tunnels became veins of defiance. But the underground world was never meant to last. It was designed for waiting, not living, for hiding, not thriving. It was a last resort, built with the deep, heavy knowledge that if it was ever needed, something irreversible had already happened. Thankfully, it never was. The bunkers were never filled. The missile orders never given. The deep doors never sealed in panic. But still, they remain, rusted, hidden, overgrown. Quiet reminders of how close the world came to living beneath itself. Preparing for the end, even while life continued above. In sunlight, in laughter, in the hope that no one would ever have to go below. And in that hope, unspoken but constant, the Cold War's greatest silence was preserved. The Cold War ends with a crowd. For decades, the Cold War had been defined by leaders, by doctrines, by speeches, by lines drawn across maps. It had lived in policy and posture, in the quiet hum of tension that touched every corner of life. But when it finally ended, it did not end with signatures or parades. It ended with footsteps, with songs, with hammers and hands and ordinary people filling the streets. The Cold War ended with a crowd. The moment came on November 9th, 1989. Berlin, a city long divided, long scarred by stone and silence, had begun to stir. Pressure had been building for months. Eastern Europe was shifting. Hungary had opened its border with Austria. Protests had grown louder, more confident, and in East Germany, the people were no longer waiting, they were walking. That night, a government official gave a press conference. He stumbled through a policy update, reading from notes, unclear and unprepared. A journalist asked when new travel rules would take effect. The answer was vague, offhanded, maybe a mistake. As far as I know, immediately. The news spread like fire. People gathered at the wall, tentatively, curiously, almost in disbelief. They asked guards if they could pass. The guards had no orders. They hesitated. They called for instruction. None came. And then, as the pressure built, as the chance rose, as the moment tipped, they opened the gates. And Berlin flowed forward, not in chaos, not in fear, but in joy, in shock, in pure, unfiltered relief. East and West met at the wall, reaching across it, climbing onto it, breaking it. Not with weapons, but with hammers, with bare hands, with tears. Bits of concrete fell like snow. The border that had once symbolized the Cold War's deepest wound was now disappearing beneath celebration. No bomb had dropped, no tanks had rolled. No president or premier had signed the final end. Instead, the Cold War slipped into history the way it had shaped so much of it, quietly, steadily, through the will of people. People who had waited, who had endured, who had chosen in the end not to be divided anymore. That night, the world watched. Not with fear this time, but with awe. The Cold War, for so long untouchable, abstract, almost mythic, had become real, and then unreal, in a single night. A wall, standing for nearly 30 years, was undone by a crowd of ordinary human beings simply moving toward each other. In the days that followed, change rippled outward. Governments fell, flags came down, elections were held. The Soviet Union itself would dissolve just 2 years later. But the moment that started it all, the moment the Cold War truly ended, came not from power, but from presence, from people filling a street and refusing to turn back. Sometimes, history does not need permission. It just needs enough people to show up. And on that night, they did. And now, after all the years, all the moments, all the careful steps we've taken through the Cold War's long shadow, we've come to the end. A quiet end. A gentle end. No battles here. No speeches now. Just the soft settling of time. Like snow melting from the edge of a rooftop. Like fog fading into morning. The Cold War is over, not with an alarm or a final note, but with a long exhale. You've been listening, slowly, patiently, as we drifted through decades of history that once felt sharp and unrelenting. And now those years are behind you. Not forgotten, just softer. Their edges smoothed by sleep. Their weight a little lighter now. The maps have changed. The broadcasts have ended. The soldiers have gone home. The walls are down. And so is your guard. You've done enough for today. More than enough. There's nothing left to study. Nothing left to follow. You can rest. Let your thoughts drift like old pages turning in a breeze. Not everything needs to be remembered. You don't need to hold the names or the numbers. You don't need to carry the details. Let them go, one by one, like flickering signals fading from the sky. They were only meant to guide you here, to this moment, this breath, this stillness. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the quiet deepen. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even in the tensest moments in history, there were pauses. There were seconds of silence. People waited. They sat in rooms, watching the same sky, listening to the same hum of machines and wondering if it would last. And somehow it did. The war that never turned hot. Never had to. You've wandered through cities split in two. Through bunkers and briefcases, borders and broadcasts, footsteps and fears. You've walked beside spies in the fog and children playing beneath sirens. You've seen the Cold War not just through power or policy, but through people, ordinary, watchful, waiting. Living lives shaped by tension they didn't choose, and holding on to hope they rarely named out loud. That hope is what brought the Cold War to an end. Not a treaty, not a victory, but a quiet insistence that the world could change, that it would change, and eventually, it did. Now there's no need to keep watch, no need to hold any line. The waiting is over, and so you can let go, gently, fully, without hesitation. Let the final echoes of this story stretch out softly, like the last light of dusk over a quiet street. Nothing more to process, nothing more to do, just the memory of a journey, moving through time like a river, carrying you steadily into stillness. If your mind wanders now, let it. If it drifts away, let it. Let it find comfort in the quiet. Let it dissolve into dreams where history floats gently in the background, distant, harmless, softened by sleep. You are safe now. The story has been told. The Cold War has ended. And so, finally, you can rest. There is peace, there is stillness, there is silence, and in that silence, there is sleep.